What is the history of OCD? I find it really interesting, but also helpful in walking through suffering to understand, oh, is this new? Has this been around for a while? Have believers suffered with this? Yes, yes, yes. So let's go back a little bit. The first word really associated consistently with what we would think is OCD in historical accounts is scruple or scruples. So scruple was probably used first by Cicero. It was a variation of it in Latin. I think it was scrupus or scrupum. But fast forward, Shakespeare used it to reflect a small weight, quantity, or measure, and others did at the time. But it started to become predominantly associated with religious, spiritual, extra pursuits. So to be scrupulous, to be overly concerned. So the person who confesses sin, they're concerned about that. They go, they confess sin, they walk away, and usually feel a little bit better. Great, God forgives me, and I need to confess it. I need to confess with others in community with certain things. And the person with scruples would get stuck on it and feel like they needed to do more, go further, or go so far as to find things that they didn't even know what they were suffering with. So this word scruple started to show up a lot in writings. And what's interesting about the history of OCD is that it was really clergy who were the first to spot it. They didn't label it OCD specifically, but scruple was oftentimes that first word that was applied. Additionally, if you're really wanting to know, religious melancholy began to be applied by 1600s, 1700s to a range of conditions that people went through. Yes, depression, but when we study accounts, it seems like they were also referencing things like phobias, and most certainly OCD, because they're talking about it being unwanted, against the person's wishes, it not making rational sense, being discouraged and depressed about that they couldn't bring to bear the things that they believed, and yet they stayed stuck on these obsessions and compulsive processes. So clergy were the first to notice and really write about these things. Which also makes sense from a historical standpoint, because who is actually writing before the printing press and before our tech era? When are we actually going to see something written down? Well, it's usually going to be kings, scribes, philosophers, clergy. And we know from history that usually kings didn't want to leave a very bad mark on history, so had some motivated reasoning of not sharing necessarily the bad things. So let's say if there was a king or royalty or something from 1,000 years ago, history would indicate that it's probably not very likely that they'd want to talk about unwanted obsessions that they're having and stuck patterns that they have. So fast forward to clergy who are writing about these things. And also, the first autobiography in English was written by Hannah Allen, and she described what seems to be very clearly OCD in her account. And I just think that's so cool that the first autobiography, and it was also a woman who wrote it in English, talked about OCD. How cool. So I believe that was 1400s. Fast forward, we have many more examples from other folks. By the time of the Reformation, Martin Luther, a very, very strong case that Martin Luther, the reformer, had OCD, John Bunyan as well. And then of the Jesuits, the Jesuit order, we have Saint Ignatius of Loyola as well, of the Jesuit order, seem to exhibit extensive OCD symptoms. And then later on, an Ignatian confessor had some really good responses to how to work with sufferers that were, I'll say, hiccuping on compulsions. And so through all sorts of writings, not only were people writing and talking about these things, but they were beginning to find some offerings and some solutions.